Hello and welcome everybody to this live masterclass on soaring, filing and soldering, tips to improve your silver jewelry making. I'm joined by the wonderful Hayley Kruger. Thank you for joining us, Hayley. Lovely to have you here today. And essentially, we're going to be grilling Hayley about soaring, filing, and soldering for the next little bit of time. But first of all, we're going to come and say hello. Also, I hope everyone enjoys my wonderful mic, my wonderful headphones. I feel like I don't know, a
Pop star.
pilot. Yeah, yeah. My one's decided not to work today, so I borrowed someone else's, and it's a vibe, it's a look. Anyway, welcome. Who do we have? Judith is here. Welcome, Judith. Carline, hiya. Hi, Ju. Hi, Jessica from Hull in Yorkshire. Kerry is here from North Yorkshire in the UK. Another Judith, awesome to have you. Dee is here. Welcome, Dee. Welcome, Carol, Joe, Shannon. Yes, come and say hi. Come and say hello to your fellow jewelers. Lovely to have you guys tuning in from all over, and hope you're having a wonderful week so far. So we did one of these last year, and it was really popular because the whole idea behind it is that, especially for beginners, but for any level of jeweler really, if we can soar well and confidently, and anything that we want to be able to soar, if we can file and kind of have good control of our filing, and if we can solder, they're kind of the fundamentals. They're kind of like the basics that mean that almost any project, whether it's something just starting out or something from our advanced diplomas that people have been doing training for years to do, you've got those fundamentals. And I think likewise, if you don't have those, and there's many jewelers, and I am one of them, who sort of say, well, I can do this one and that one, but I avoid that one out of these three. And I know for me, it was soldering for a long time. I was like, I'm just not really into the whole soldering thing. It's kind of scary. It goes wrong sometimes and I get frustrated. So I'll just design things around that. And it's so restrictive, obviously, if we let our fear kind of get in the way. And then once I decided to actually just face that fear, learn how to solder, and now I love it. And it's all good. And I think that there's probably at least one of those for all of us where we're like, actually, if I developed this, there's so much I could do. But the idea is that jewelry making is it's not easy, it's not hard, but it is, if you know how to do these things and you have those fundamentals, then kind of any project is possible. Um, so yeah, so we have Hayley. Before we get started, Hayley, do you just want to? I know most people will probably know who you are if you've joined any of our classes with Hayley before, but do you want to just do a little introduction,
Sure.
and then we'll get into talking about some of the techniques.
Yes, so I am a jeweler. I have a studio in Cirencester, which is in the west of the country in England. But I have been involved with Jewelers Academy and the London Jewelry School since for a very long time, rather.
Like a decade or
Yeah, something like
something around that point. Yeah.
and yes, teaching classes, of course, but also learning myself. So my practice has progressed in that time a heck of a lot. And actually, it's been through teaching myself and working with students. And I started where you are starting. But now I am a goldsmith. I'm a fair trade and fair mine goldsmith. I work on fine jewelry and commissions. And I'll tell you that what Jess was saying about facing your fears and learning fundamentals, well, those fundamentals just keep on shifting as you go on. So you are always learning, and that's why we love jewelry making so much, because you're continuously facing your fears and you're continuously you're grabbing those fears and you're throwing them down the road. So it's a wonderful place to be.
Absolutely. Love that. And I think, yeah, it's just normalizing at the beginning. These things can feel frustrating. And I think what we do a lot with our beginners, and as we go through, is technical challenges to kind of get us to do that same thing over and over again, like the soldering masterclass. which is in the silver jewellery diploma, and we used to teach as well, London Jewellery School, is very much about let's just solder for a whole day without any pressure to necessarily make a finished piece at the end. And it's incredible to see people's skills develop in that way, because then when you go to make a piece, after that it's like, oh, I don't have to stress about the soldering bit. I'm pretty confident with that. And of course things will still, challenges will still come up, but those fundamentals are so, so important, aren't they? So
Yes.
should we start with solder? Because I know it's saw, file, and solder, and we will go through them all, but I feel like that one is a juicy one.
Yes, I
And
agree.
and I'm sure, even people who've been soldering for years, we all have different ways of doing it. I love seeing the different tutors teach in different ways, use different kind of things, because I think there's no right or wrong way, but it's just great to learn different ways and kind of mash them together to get our own style. So do you want to share, Hayley, what are some of the common kind of pitfalls or mistakes that jewelers or students make with soldering, and then we can talk about some of the solutions as well.
Yes, so we're all racked with fear, especially when it comes to playing with fire, and so you should be. So when you come to soldering, what people often do is they'll hold the torch a little too far away. That's for me the most common thing, because you don't want to melt anything or you don't want to damage anything. But actually, the projects, they need the maximum heat that you can give them. Obviously, not a flamethrower, but get your torch closer, because it needs the heat. The faster you can get in and get the job done and get out, the better. So there's a flame, and on that flame you've got the length of the flame, but in there you've got a bright blue section. The tip of the bright blue section has to touch your work, and if it's not touching your work, it's not hot enough. So don't hold the flame too far away. That's the most common thing.
Yeah, and I find that I sometimes take it too close because I'm
Yeah,
like, I want to get it hotter, so I put it closer, and the tip of the flame is
you're
gone.
smothering it. Yeah,
Yeah.
so don't smother it either, because there's three things that can happen. A, you're smothering it, so it's dissipating the heat. B, you can actually get flashback, so it can actually be dangerous to do that. And the other thing has immediately jumped out of my mind. It will come back to me.
Yeah, yeah, and it depends what torch you use as well, doesn't it? Like, um, I find like the hand torches are great for starting out because I just have so much control with them, and they're quite straightforward. And I was using a torch with gas on the other day, and if I hold it too far up, it stops because it's
That's what my other point was going to be.
okay,
Yes.
yes,
So if you hold it at a right angle, it actually cuts out.
yeah,
So hold it at a slight angle like that. Oh, I've actually got one here. You want to hold it slightly like that,
yeah. What's the way? Show us the way you shouldn't hold it, just for clarity.
not like that.
Yeah. Naughty wrist, happy wrist. It's like in ballet class.
I mean, you'll get away
Um,
with it for a while, and then, as you said, it just cuts out. So
yeah, yeah. Okay, great. So making sure the flame is at the right distance is really important. What other things kind of come up for students when they're learning soldering?
So I have a little checklist that I often say to people. Well, first of all, you've got to have a really good join. So if it's all in the preparation. So if your join is if it's too gappy, it's not going to be strong. And also, it might be down to our eyesight. But if there is even the slightest gap like that, it's not going to join, because solder will flow through that and it won't fill the gap. You can get away with a little gap if your filing isn't brilliant. But I always say about 2/3 of the metal should be touching, but really all of it should be touching. So the checklist is: have you prepared and got a good join? 2, have you added your flux? This is another very common people, and there's so much to do.
Yeah, we forget sometimes. Yeah.
So have you added your flux? Because if you don't, it will melt or burn the surface. B, have you put solder there? Because again, you might forget it, or sometimes you might think that a piece of solder is actually, or a little bit of silver is actually solder, and you put that there instead of solder. And you're thinking, why is it not flowing? There might have been a mix-up. And the last one that was really, so that's 3 things on the checklist: good join, is there flux, is there solder, heat conduction is the fourth point. So
Mm.
it's that checklist. And that means that when you're soldering, you're not just focusing on the join. You have to conduct the heat around the entire project, or if it's very big, the general area around the solder area. Because silver solder, that's how it works. If you just focus on the joint, it will not flow.
Yeah, yeah, great tips. And I think sometimes we think, oh, I know all of those, but it's good to remind ourselves because I even just the other day I was soldering and it was quite a complex piece. I totally forgot to put flux on. And I was like, of course I fluxed it. Like I wouldn't not do that. And I was there for ages, like it's not flowing. And then I was like, no, I did miss that step. So it's, yeah, good to have that kind of checklist in your head. And you guys on live with us, if you have any questions for Hayley as well, I forgot to say this at the beginning, feel free to ask them either in the chat or there's an ask a question section as well, and I'll try and keep an eye on those. Also, come and share with us, like, what are your biggest challenges around soldering? Because it'd be interesting to know. And perhaps Hayley could just very briefly explain for anyone who's brand new what flux is, what solder is, and what soldering is, just as a quick little recap.
Yes, so you've got your metal, which is, in our case, we're going to be using silver or maybe copper to practice on. And we use silver solder to solder the metal together. So solder is a mix of other alloys, including silver, and the other alloys allow it to run more easily, and they have a lower melting temperature to the metal that we're working on. And in order for that to flow well, we need to put flux on the solder join, and that is used in any kind of welding or brazing or that soldering on larger scales. They use a flux. It comes in different forms, so you can use a liquid flux, borax, which you can grind to a paste, or you get it in granule form as well. And you also get a gel form, and all of them are fine, they all work, but it's really vital. Is that, what else? Did I miss anything? Good.
No, that sounds good. That's a good little overview. And a few questions have come through, so I'll ask you those. Rochelle says, do you prefer to pre-ball your solder before applying? So for anyone who's not sure, there's different ways of soldering. You can kind of place the solder onto the piece and then work with it, or you can do like pick soldering, which is where you kind of ball it up. You heat up the solder by itself, it turns into a little ball, and then you need a bit more control, but you kind of put it on. And everyone does it in different ways. But how do you like to work, Hayley, or do you use a mixture?
Yes, I use a mixture. So pick soldering is a technique that if you learn from the beginning, great. But if you don't have a steady hand, it's a bit tricky. So what I do, and I didn't learn that. So I learned by placing pieces of solder on the project and then heating them up. But sometimes allowing the metal to run first, if it's a tricky thing that might melt easily or is very delicate, you're shortening the amount of time it needs to be heated up. So instead of using a pick and picking it up and then placing it whilst it's all heating up at the same time, which is too scary, I run the little bits of solder into balls on the side. I have them there, and then I will place them like I would a normal piece of solder. So I do a bit of both. And
That's nice, yeah.
Yeah, and a technique, and actually for using borax to put the little balls in place helps, because it's a bit, when it dries, it's a bit crusty. It allows the solder balls to sit neatly in the powdery stuff.
I love that idea of like preparing the balls beforehand, because I'm always a little bit stressed, like, okay, I've got the torch in my left hand, which isn't my dominant hand, and then I've got like the solder pick here, and then I'm trying to like heat that up, and there's a lot going on. So it's nice to have little ways of streamlining the process.
Can I also mention sweat soldering, which seems that it's a slightly more advanced technique, but it is worth mentioning because it's running solder on a piece. Let's say you're sandwiching two pieces together, and you don't want to prop, let's say that's there, and I don't want to prop my piece of solder there, because when it runs, it might run all over the piece and be very visible. So if you run some solder on the underside of the piece that's going on top, that will then already have run, so you're cutting out some of the time you need it. You pickle that, and then you flux and you sandwich it together and you heat the whole thing up. And then you get a much more neat solder join with sweat soldering. But that is, a slightly advanced technique that we learn on the silver diploma course in the soldering day. So it's one of my favorites, and it's probably a technique I use a lot now, but it's definitely worth practicing when you get to that point.
I agree, actually. I love sweat soldering, and often I forget that that's an option. If it's not, an obvious piece to sweat solder, often I'll do a really, because I think part of soldering is just making decisions and deciding how you're going to solder it, and
Yes.
actually what's the most efficient way. And sweat soldering is always a really nice, efficient way, I find. Um, so great to be reminded of that one as well. So thank you for the question, Rochelle. There's another question from Jennifer about flux. She says she uses the borax cone. Any tips on getting a good creamy flux paste when swirling the cone? Sometimes it seems to take forever.
Yes.
Yes.
So my tip is, well, first of all, if you've got a brand new cone and dish, the dish itself is a very porous ceramic material. And that actually takes quite a long time to stop being porous and absorbing all the moisture. So what you have to do is just keep on grinding it and be patient. It will eventually block up all the pores or the holes in it. But my tip for that is grind it. But when you put water back in your dish, don't fill it with water and then go off to your bench or what have you. Put your water in the dish, tip the water out, and the moisture that's left there, grind that, and that will give you enough moisture for what you need. And then have a bowl of water next to you when you're working, and just dip the cone in it every once in a while, and then sort of grind it.
That's a great tip. So if you have too much, if you have like a puddle, like a river of water, you're just not getting anywhere with it.
No,
But
you'll
just
get nowhere. I mean, equally, you don't want it to be too thick and creamy, because then you're going to get a lot of bubbling and crustiness on your piece when it dries. I'd rather have that than too liquid and not doing what it's got to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jennifer's just followed up, said, would it help to soak the dish first? But it sounds like you need to get the flux into the pores. So perhaps it's
Yes,
just when you get a new one, it always takes longer, doesn't it? It does
it
get
does. You
easier.
can actually, sorry to interrupt, you can actually, if you put it in the oven at 60 degrees for a certain period of time, it cures the clay. But look that up on the internet, because I'm not an expert and I don't want to crack it. It's I'm pretty sure I did that in the past, but I'm a bit lazy now, and I don't have an oven in the studio, so I just get a bit of a lining in it, and then eventually it's fine.
Yeah. And I think just knowing that the first few, it's like when you get new shoes, like it's going to be uncomfortable for a bit, but it won't always be that
Yeah.
way. You just need to kind of persevere and work through it. And yeah, I've definitely done that when I've used boraxes, have the the water on the bench, because it dries out as well, doesn't it?
Yes,
So it's kind of dipping in every now and
it
then.
does, and especially if you're in a warm room, if you've got central heating on or what have you, it will dry out even quicker. So yes.
Wonderful. Nadine asks, her projects are mostly copper based. Are the techniques the same for silver as for copper?
Yes, yes, that's the wonderful thing about copper and silver. They work very well as a complement, because sterling silver has copper in it. The copper content in silver hardens it and makes it more durable. So all the techniques that you use working with silver are exactly the same as with copper.
Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it? And it means you can practice in copper first, because silver is obviously more expensive. So if you're trying out new things, it's brilliant to be able to practice in copper. Although silver is lovely to work in as well.
Yes, in time you'll probably shift over, but mixing the metals together as well is a really wonderful thing, because you've got the dark and the light and the lovely colors that copper makes. So yeah, they work well together.
Yeah, absolutely. Carline asked, she said, I bought some bezel wire and tried soldering it with both normal solder, not sure what normal solder is, maybe it's hard, and easy silver solder, but it would not flow. Any suggestions? I guess a lot of the suggestions will be around the things that we've talked about so far, that checklist. But yeah, perhaps you could talk a little bit about, particularly if you've got a very thin piece and a thick piece together, or just working with different thicknesses of metal and bezels.
Yes, I will talk about that, but I want to just talk about normal solder, because if you haven't had much experience, and now this might not be the case in this situation, but often people have done lead soldering before, stained glass soldering, and assume that it's going to be the same as the type of soldering that jewelers or silversmiths do, and it's absolutely not. So that solder is very, very soft, and it melts at under 100 degrees, and we can't use it because that can't be worn against the skin. So if you're using that solder, it's no good, and it won't work on silver.
Oh, okay, yes, because
Solder that
Carline says normal solder is what used for electronics. So you're
right,
right, Hayley, that
yeah.
is a non-jewelry product.
It's
But
a
I'm
nice
learning something. Thank you.
Yes, it happens a lot because people do lots of crafts, and so I hear that question quite often. So yes, it's unfortunately not a transferable material. So that is a big reason why that wasn't fusing together or soldering together. So if you're using easy solder, ideally you should be using hard silver solder, because it's the most durable, and then you work your way down to the easy. And in terms of soldering bezel to a plate, what Jess was talking about is you might have a piece of silver sheet or even copper sheet. And if you've got a very big or very thick piece of silver or copper sheet and a very delicate bezel, you need to focus your heat on the sheet because that's your dominant amount of metal, and it's going to need more heat to heat it up, because the two pieces that are being soldered together need to reach the same temperature at the same time. But if we focus our flame only on the bezel, I'm sure this has happened to some of you, you will lose your bezel. It will just melt. So you've got to angle your flame in certain ways so that you're focusing on the base mostly.
Yeah, great advice. And I guess that's the same for any, like when you've got a dominant and a less dominant, a smaller piece, like if you're soldering on a little tube setting or something to a bigger piece, it's really focusing on that larger piece.
It is.
Brilliant. Loads of questions. I love this. Awesome. There's been some questions around copper and soldering copper. Is there such thing as copper solder? And what solder is best to use on copper?
So there is such a thing as copper solder, but it's very rarely available in the UK. They have it in the US, and over the years, I've seen many people trying to get it, and people give up just because the import taxes are very expensive. So we mostly use silver solder on copper. So what that means is that your cleaning up has to be really good because you want to get rid of all the silver solder on the copper. But there's actually another tip in that. Don't put too much solder on. So less is more with silver solder. Otherwise it pools and it blobs on the surface of your metal. And you can, believe it or not, get an invisible solder seam using silver solder on copper.
Yeah, yeah. We see that in the soldering masterclass
We
because they
do.
do like a kind of cylinder in copper, and they manage it, you know, and that's in the first term of the silver diploma. So yeah, it's a really good practice. But I like that idea of less being more, and actually you don't want these big lines of silver that you've got to try and get out ideally. Yes, wonderful. There's also been some chat about fire stain, which was obviously always comes up when we're talking about solder. So Rosie said, fire stain, I've tried so many different things to avoid it, but I can't work out what I'm doing wrong. Help. I added the help.
Well, we've all been there, and we'll probably still always be there. Basically, I mentioned earlier that there's copper in sterling silver. And sterling silver, the copper in there is there to harden it up. But the downside of having it there is that it tarnishes. And because, as you know, copper tarnishes. And so when we heat it up, like everything, when you heat it up, it goes black. And the copper inside the metal goes black too. But if we pickle it consistently after every time we heat it up, it should clean it off. However, if we don't heat the project up well enough, so this is holding the flame too far away, not having a big enough flame, being there for ages thinking, why is this not working? All of that contributes to creating fire stain because the copper deep inside the silver is tarnishing more and more and more. And it can be polished out, but it just depends where it's sitting in the surface of the metal, and really what you want do is practice your soldering skills so you don't get fire stain.
Yeah, yeah. So it's one of those things where prevention is better than cure, where
Yes,
as you improve your technical ability, it should happen less.
it should
Um,
happen. But I will say it still happens to me sometimes.
yeah, it still
So
happens
it's
to
it's just
everyone.
down
Yeah,
to the type of project and getting the job done quick and getting out.
yeah, yeah. I always remember making this. One of the first pieces I made was this giant silver bangle, and it had like this giant puddle in the middle of fire stain, and that was my first discovery of fire stain because
Yeah.
I wanted, and it was all shiny, and had it been textured and a few other things, it probably could have hidden a multitude of sins. But I think it's especially prevalent for those of us making big, kind of
Yes.
silver, shiny pieces. So
That's exactly right, Jess, because with bigger pieces you need even bigger torches or more heat. So and that's tricky and scary, and you might not have that kind of equipment. So yeah.
yeah, brilliant. All right, thank you. Thank you for sharing. A couple more questions on soldering, and then we'll move on to talking about soaring and filing as well, because they are important too. Although I know that there's always, soldering is always a lot to talk about. Um, let's have a look. Oh, Sue says, what safety issues do you need to consider with any fumes given off during soldering? Maybe you can talk about what you do in your practice in your workshop, Hayley.
Yeah, well, to be honest, there aren't really any fumes unless you've got chemicals on the surface of your metal. So when you've got clean silver or clean metal, it shouldn't be giving off any fumes. Borax is fine; it's a natural mineral and it is okay. And as far as I'm aware, liquid flux is also okay because it's been tested and it's used industry wide. You don't need to wear a mask, but if you feel like you're in an environment where it's not really well ventilated, you open a window, but you can also buy extraction equipment. But really, extraction equipment is mostly used for polishing because
Mm,
it's the dust that's created by polishing compounds and the metals. That's the stuff that you need to be worried about in the long run, not at this level. And if you're using the bigger industrial polishes, that's more of a problem. But if you've got maybe chest issues or asthma or what have you, wear a mask when you're polishing, but not with soldering. You're fine with soldering.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's just using a lot of it's like using our common sense, isn't it? Around if you feel like anything is giving off a lot of smoke or a lot of, I mean, there will be something going wrong if that's the case. And,
Yeah.
sometimes there's like inclusions on the bench or things that we haven't noticed that are kind of stuck in the solder bit. But if you notice that, just stop, open a window. But generally speaking, it's safe and it's fine to do soldering. People do it at home. It's, not not something to worry about. Go on, Hayley.
The most common thing that, sorry, I was desperate to get
No, go for it. I can
the
see you
common
ready.
thing that I've seen that's a hazard in soldering is when people put down their torch without thinking about where they put down their torch. So
Mm,
it's still on, and it's maybe there's some tissue paper there from you drying off your pieces, and you think, what's that? And the tissue paper is there, or the torch has fallen over. So really be mindful about having a clear space to put down your torch or switch it off before you carry on doing something else.
yeah, good tip, good tip. I remember someone once at the jewelry school just put the torch on the wall, like just facing right on the wall with the flame on. So luckily we were all there. We were like, turn it off. It was fine. It was just a little black hole on the wall. Um, But I think it's when you're so focused. That's the
Yes,
thing.
that's what
That's
it
why I
is.
say it's common sense. So it's just reminding yourself before you start what your plan of action is. I'm going to turn the torch on, I'm going to heat it up, then I'm going to put it down, and making sure you don't do these things when you're, super tired because it is still working with the flame. But we had what 40,000 students and there was, very few accidents, so it's nothing to worry about. Um, there are a couple of questions about pickle. Um, how often do you change your pickle? How long to leave things in the pickle for? Perhaps you could just talk a little bit about pickle.
I change my pickle when it's not working well anymore. So I will get as much out of it as I possibly can. It starts to turn a bit blue, but actually it's still usable when it's blue. And it's usually because there's been copper or copper content in there that's turning it blue. Um, it's still usable, and just keep on using it. I've been running workshops for the last few weeks with blue pickle, and it's fine. But in terms of how long, it depends on how often you use it. So keep an eye on it. If it's starting to turn blue, it's weakening a little bit, but you can keep on using it. If there's a lot of dirt in it, that's also a good time to get rid of it. Yes, that's basically it. Don't leave it on at night time or when you're finished working. Switch it off because it does evaporate, and make sure you keep the lid on it because, again, it evaporates and it's a waste.
Yeah, yeah. And if you make mistakes, it's okay because we all do with pickle at some point. It's good
Yes.
to have the guidelines and stick to them as much as possible, but there's always solutions. And you'll see people inside the Jewelers Academy Facebook group talking about their pickle as well, because all sorts of things go on. It gets too weak, or it's, they've left it on overnight by accident, they need to sort it out, or, disposing of it in a kind of in the best possible way for the environment, things like that. So, yeah, I feel like we could do a class on all of these different, like a
Yeah, we
class on
could.
pickle, a class. Well, we do talk about them a lot more, but
Yeah.
but I do want to move on now, just a little bit talking about soaring and filing because they are also part of the topic. But I know there's a few more questions, so I will try and come back to them if we get time at the end. So, should we talk about soaring next? Perhaps you could talk about like what the common mistakes students make with soaring and any kind of troubleshooting things they can do to help improve.
So sewing is a funny one because when sometimes some people just start and they'll not break a single blade and they just take to it like a duck to water, and some people really struggle. So it doesn't really matter what camp you're in, but at some point you're going to find it a bit challenging. So the most common thing that people find difficult is getting started. So what you need to do is, instead of just starting to sew, create a little nick. So on the edge of your metal, go up with your blade once, twice, 3 times, and then you've got a little indent when you can put the blade into, and then you can start to sew. Then you really start to sew. So that's one thing, instead of it slipping and getting started. The other thing is lubricate your blade. So it can be beeswax, it can be cut lube, it can be even a little bit of oil. And I've actually used my lip balm sometimes if I can't find what I need. And that's all the same thing. As long as it's slightly oily, it does its job. That really helps. And then when you come to turning a corner, so a right angle or sharp corner, this is the thing that frustrates probably the most amount of people, is you've got to sew and you've got to keep on sewing, and you're not going hard and fast. You're just going slowly and steadily. You're not putting any pressure on the blade. But when you need to turn, you don't stop. Because it's not a piece of paper, it's a piece of paper. So if you turn the corner, the blade's going to face one way and your frame's going to face the other way, and you're going to probably break your blade. So what you need to do is you actually need to use the blade to file a little bit of a hole, a little bit of a space that gives it space to turn within. So on the spot, you're sewing, but you're also essentially rubbing it up against the edge of the metal, and you're creating a little file mark and more space. And once you're doing that, keep it going up and down, and then you're starting to turn as you're doing it. If you stop and you turn, you're going to get it jammed, guaranteed. So keep on going up and down, and then you can go off in the next direction.
Yeah, yeah. I love that because I think when we first start soaring, we break lots of blades. That's really normal. It's, get a packet, expect to break them all. And I think it's good to break blades at the beginning because that's how you learn kind of the tension point of, because with the saw, you need some tension, you need some movement.
Yeah.
But if it's too much, if it's like you said, if it's too like twisty or forced or it's stuck, then it's going to ping and break. And so it's quite good to learn where the breaking point is. I feel like that's, for me anyway, that was definitely part of the journey. But yeah, that was a great tip for kind of how to get around those kind of edges and those corners. And also I like the starting tip of just doing a few downward strokes before you then go into up and down. What about, because when I first started soaring, the only soaring I'd done before was in like DT class at school with wood, and I was pushing. I was like pushing. Yeah, and that No pushing.
No,
Stop it.
the blade does all the work for you. So you mentioned about the tension in the blade. If you've got a nice tight tension, and when you, it's like a guitar string, you've got to ping it and it sounds ding. So once that's good, you don't need to put any pressure on the blade. Just the up and down motion will actually move it forward. If you do put pressure on the blade, again, you're likely to, either the blade will sag within the frame or it might snap. So just relax. And this is actually the most important thing about sewing is relax, because we're often always tense and we're worried and our shoulders are up and the elbows up and we're pushing hard. And then actually just relax your shoulders. I always get people to get their hands down by their side, both feet on the ground. Don't have your feet crossed. And then you just relax and you're just chilling. So slow and steady rather than hard and fast. And you should be fine. But another thing is, if you're having a really bad day, and it could be for whatever reason, walk away from the sewing, because I can guarantee you're not going to do very well if you're, have a go. But if you break up 2 blades, that's it. Call it a day on the sewing and do something else.
Yeah. So it's an interesting technique because you're sawing through metal, which is something really hard, but actually you need to be relaxed and quite
Yes.
soft and quite kind of, holding the saw frame not tightly and squeezing, but just gently, and it's the up and down motion, isn't it, as well, not an angle kind of.
Not the pressure. Yes.
Yeah, when you're thinking about sawing like a tree or something, it's like you see them right there, whereas it's
Yes.
upright and quite gentle, and it can be quite meditative and
Yes.
quite relaxing when you get into that
Lovely.
zone. Julie asked, do you turn the blade or the metal?
You can do both, actually. So you turn them both at the same time. So it just depends. I mean, some people can actually saw backwards or sideways. So if you're comfortable with doing that, turn the blade, and then whilst you've got them, keep them at the same angle and then turn the whole thing. Or if you so let's say your blade is facing forward. If you turn the metal without moving the blade, the same thing will happen as before. You're going to get a snagging. So that there's got to be a bit of space, and you've got to keep them orientated in the same direction.
Yeah, great tips. Thank you guys for all the questions. There's those coming through. I realize I'm missing some, but I'm trying to do them all. So please don't take it personally if I miss some, but I'll try and get through as many as possible. They're great questions. Carline says, what's the best blade size to use? Which I think is a good starting point to talk about the different blade sizes and how you choose them.
Yeah, so the most commonly used is a 2-cut, so 2/0. That's the one I probably use the most. It's quite sturdy and steady. It doesn't snap when you put it in the frame. It does pretty much all jobs. But if you want to do some slightly more refined detail, cutting out, 4/0 is good. So, and then you get a 6/0, which is even finer than that. So the higher the number, the finer they go, because there's more teeth per millimeter or something like that. So yes, I'd stick with the 2s, but if you want to get in some really sharp, neat corners, go for a 4. But the more you go down the numbers, if you get really heavy tension, you could even snap the blade just by getting the tension in the frame. But 2s and 4s are the ones that I use the most.
Yeah, wonderful. And there's different qualities of saw blade as well, aren't there? Yeah. There's some, and I find like with most jewelry tools, you kind of get what you pay for. So you can work with any of them, but the slightly more expensive ones do tend to last me a little bit longer anyway. Which kind of brings us on to Becky's question. She asked, what's the benefit to the more expensive saw frames? And I think this is a really personal question. Everyone will have a different answer, but I'd be interested in your answer, Hayley. How do you feel about, there's a whole range of saw frames now. I knew this was going to be the answer. Old school. Pretty much every jeweler who's been making for a long time is just like, I'm fine.
And I've actually still got one, the first one I ever bought, which didn't even have the 3rd key. The other ones, they look lovely, and they probably work quite well too. But if you go and you look at I've even seen photos of workshops at Tiffany's and Garrard and what have you. They've got those ones, because it's actually not about how good the frame is. It's about the technique. So practice, practice, practice. Don't spend money on the most expensive frame. People do say that they feel better in their hands, but the pros don't use those things. They use the basics.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's what I've heard consistently across the board. I have the Green Lion one because it looks cool, and
They do look
I
beautiful.
just like things that look cool, but I'm not expecting it to make me better at soaring. I do find maybe it's like a psychology thing. Like I feel good, and it's like when you put on a nice outfit, you're like, I look
Yeah,
better, but you're still the same person. Like you still, ultimately, you still got the same personality. You're either nice to be around or you're not.
well, we're
And I think
attracted to pretty things, so there you go.
yeah.
You know.
So
So,
it's a luxury purchase, isn't it? It's totally unnecessary. You can have a whole career in jewelry, and most people do without any of those things. So it's really just fun and um and I guess it's personal preference as well. Um yeah. So but it's always good to know, and I just find it so funny because every jeweler who I've worked with who's worked for a long time in the industry says the same thing. Like I'm happy with my £12 saw that I've had for 20 years. Brilliant. Let's have a look and see. Jennifer was saying, how do I keep my saw blade from breaking? Is it common for the blade to break even if you're not a beginner? So do you still break
yeah,
break
yeah.
blades
First
a
of all,
lot?
they wear down. So after a while, they're just going to snap or buckle. Um, Lubrication, I would say, is the most important key to stop it from snagging. And yeah, I think it's just practice. I mean, there are some days or some weeks I haven't broken blades for weeks, and then they'll have one day when I break 3 blades in an hour. So it just depends on. It's down to mood,
Stress. Yeah, when
mood
you're
and how
stressed.
the day's going, and yeah,
Yeah, taking it out on the piece.
yeah,
Whereas when you're kind of like life is good, it's all. And
yeah,
I think some of it is just about, and we talk a lot about this, don't we, anyway, Hayley, just forgiving yourself if you're
yeah.
just not having a great day or it's just not going to plan. It happens with soldering as well. Like sometimes the solder just flows and everything's easy and life is good, and then the next piece is just not up for it for,
Absolutely.
whatever reason. So it's giving yourself like lots of grace as well.
Yes, and allowing yourself to step away, go and have a cup of tea, go and have a good night's sleep, or go and have a walk, and that invariably will make a difference.
Makes life better. One more on soaring, and then we're going to move on to filing. Janet says, "What's the secret to soaring straight?" I like that question.
I would slow and steady, and long strokes. So don't go hard and fast. Long, even strokes, so you can kind of see where you're looking at, and direction in terms of where you're holding it doesn't matter. Everybody has a different preference on that, but slow and steady. And instead of having, let's say you're using a Sharpie as your guideline, a normal Sharpie is quite thick. So your guideline is either the outside of the Sharpie on the left or the right. But maybe if you score a line, so you put a scratch mark in, you've got a very thin little line, and that will give you a slightly better guide,
Mm,
hopefully.
yeah, yeah. Sounds super obvious, but I find if I can see what I'm doing, it helps. And I feel like a lot of the time I can't quite see for one reason or another. So getting the right position for me makes a
Yes.
huge difference, and
And a
the
good lamp.
lighting.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Wonderful. Okay, I know there are a few more on this, but I'm going to move on. So we have a little bit of time for filing because it's also super important. And I saw someone say earlier about the soldering, they were like, I just can't get a good join. And this kind of comes down to our filing, doesn't it? Or perhaps our soaring. So what are the common mistakes people make with filing and how can they rectify them?
So filing is there to correct your sawing. That's actually not true. Filing is there to clean things up. If you're filing to make a solder join, that's really tricky because we are human. We can't file or cut straight, as we've already discussed. So when you're filing, let's say you've got two edges that you're bringing together to solder together. When you're filing like that, what we tend to do is we do this.
Mm.
And then you end up with a curve on the top like that. We all do it. So again, a bit like sewing, slow down. Slow down, get at eye level, and make sure that you're sewing really slow and you're just taking your time and you're watching the angle of your saw and the angle of your hand. And that's really important. Another thing you can do, just grab a file, is on your table, so that's a normal file, on your table with the handle off the edge, you can actually turn your piece of metal.
I love this. We get a demonstration now.
Turn your piece of metal upside down and drag it. So that's already flat, it's on the table. And if you're dragging it, but again, slow and steady, you're watching that you're not tilting it or angling it. And then you actually, that's a very nifty trick. I use that quite a lot.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's being aware of what your bias is. Like some of us slant one way or another way. And I heard a jeweler once say, if you know which way you slant, you can kind of adjust and how, and also turning the piece around a lot. But yeah, being aware of where you do. I definitely do that where I kind of curve it at the end and then end up with this little whoop.
Yeah.
Not
another thing, I'm just trying to look for another piece of metal, but another thing that people do, this isn't quite right, but let's say, for example, I've got a lumpy bit there and I want to file that away. What you don't want to do is file like that, because then I'll have a flat section there. So what I do want to do is follow the curve. So I want to file like that, and that will bring all the areas that are too high down at the same time, but I'm maintaining the curve.
Yeah.
So don't file on one spot at a time, because you're just going to have another flat spot.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like whenever I've watched jewelers file to learn from them, it's always been quite controlled, like slow and controlled. Because when I first started filing, I was like, let's just get it away. But actually, obviously, you can speed up. But I think similar to the soaring, it's kind of like they're like slow and thoughtful about their file marks. Perhaps we could talk a bit as well about the different types of file and what we might use them for, different thicknesses and also different sizes.
So on a basic level, we have the big flat files, similar to the one that I've just shown, and that has two variations. That has your normal flat file, and that has a half round and a flat. You do get other shapes, but these are the most commonly used. And these are your heavy duty tools. They're going to be getting rid of the big lumps and bumps after you've sawn, or if you're shaping something, that's what you're going to need. And then you get your needle files, and they come in lots of different shapes. So you've got round, D-shaped, flat, triangular, square, and they're good for getting in all sorts of corners and angles, and so they're really useful, and those are essential tools. But in terms of cut, you get different cuts. So these are 2-cut, which means that's a medium coarseness. You also get a 4-cut, which is your super fine, which is good for polishing or towards polishing, and you get 0 cut, which is very coarse. So again, like most things in jewelry making, the finer you go, well, in this case, the finer the cut, the softer the file. So the way I would work it is I would saw. You've got lumpy bumpy bits. I get rid of the lumpy bumpy bits and reshape with my big file, and then I move on to my needle files, which are also 2-cut, or you could also have 4-cuts. I have a mix of both. And then that refines the bigger file marks, and then I move on to sandpaper or other sanding materials as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots to learn. Lots of lovely things to learn. We do have a few more questions on soldering. I'm going to come back to those in just a minute. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about the silver diploma, because this is kind of our solution, I suppose, to learning these techniques. This is what we really cover very strongly in the diploma in silver jewelry, which is a 1-year training to become a professional jeweler from complete beginner. You can join as a complete beginner or as someone who's made some jewelry before and wants to improve. And I think one of the great projects on that diploma that really kind of signifies these three saw, file, and solder skills is the kite project. Or sometimes we call it the jigsaw project. And we put it in there really to challenge people. But I think it not only does it challenge, but it really puts these skills to the test. So you start with a silver square and a copper square, and you cut them out, and you've got to cut, triangles of each, and they all have to match up to make a square together with two silver and two copper. So you're sawing in a straight line that we spoke about. You are filing to make sure, if you're getting those joins really flush, and then you're soldering all along those seams. There's also some polishing and finishing there. But there's lots of kind of things like that we cover. And Hayley is one of the tutors on the program who teaches some of the classes. She is also one of the mentors. She's also worked with us over the years to develop the diploma programs and the curriculum and also the marking criteria. So she's very involved. So Hayley, maybe you could just talk a little bit about the diploma and who you would recommend it for.
Well, as you said, I've taught on the diploma for a while, and what I love about the diploma is the progress that you see from somebody who started to when they've graduated, because it's quite remarkable to think that somebody can barely saw or struggles to solder at the beginning, and by the end of it, they've got a collet set ring. And so it's the progress that you can go from being a beginner to being relatively confident, if not setting up your own business. So that's the thing that I love most about this course. And the support is amazing. It's amazing. I mean, when I have my mentor groups with students, my one-to-ones, that's the thing that people comment on the most is the support and the community that's created on there. And it's even better than in-person classes, because in-person classes, people walk away at the end of the day. That's it, the day's done. But here, you have lots of time. You've got breathing space. You've got a week to do a project. And you've got a lovely community to help you through it as well. So.
Absolutely. I love that. I think as well, like for anyone who struggles with seeing things or eyesight or any of those things I mean, we love in-person courses as well, and we encourage people to do those too. But I think one of the things I really love about learning online is how you can see such close-ups of the things we're talking about, of like the moment that the solder flows on all these different pieces, or exactly how to rub over that setting, or, whatever it is, the kind of angles that we need to get to be able to manipulate the metal. And I know I always struggle to be like, I can't quite see, but I kind of get the drift. And I think being able to like pause and rewind and go back is amazing. But like you said, Hayley, and everyone always says this, it's really the community that, and that kind of accountability, the marking, and kind of keeping on track. But I love, there's lots of obviously previous diploma students here, because we've got some comments. Flashbacks, the kite project is a pain. And Armani said, let's not talk about the past. So I love that.
But look where you are now, Armani. So.
There we go. On to fine. Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it is, the kite project is an example of where we really like almost like boot camp you, put you through your paces, do something so hard that when you come to make jewelry after, you're like, this is fine. I've got this, like I've done a lot harder things. But yes, it was slightly mean of us to put it in there.
But
Tough
we
love.
said it at the beginning, it's all about challenges, jewelry making. And when you finish one challenge, you move on to the next challenge. And that's what keeps us here, because it's interesting and exciting and keeps you curious and keeps you on your toes as well.
Yeah, wonderful. So if you are interested in joining the diploma, there is a button below which has a diploma in silver jewelry. You can go ahead and sign up now. If you want to speak to us about it, if you're not sure yet, then you're welcome to book on a discovery call. The deadline to sign up for the 18-month payment plan, which means you can spread the cost over 18 months, which is the most affordable option, is the 10th of February, which is scarily close. I think we're on the 2nd now, aren't we? So it's just, 8 days away. So do have a look, do take advantage of that. There's also a special bonus if you sign up before the 10th of February. We give you 8 months worth of Makers membership for free. So you can start right away learning, looking at the videos, kind of working through some just basic preparation work. So the come September when the course starts, you're sort of ready to go. We also have toolkits and material kits. So we provide everything that you need. So you don't even need to go shopping. And we do those at cost price, so we keep them as affordable as possible for our students. And there are a limited number of those, so if you're interested in purchasing those, then I would recommend doing that as early as you can in the year. But like I said, if you have any questions about it, feel free to get in touch with us because that deadline is coming up. And for those of you already on a diploma, that's the deadline to sign up for the next year, or just to commit to doing the next year to be able to get the discounts that you guys have. So just a little reminder of that. We're going to do a couple more questions. I know we're coming to the end, but there were just a couple that I missed that I feel like would be fun to go back and do, if that's okay with you, Hayley.
Yeah.
One of them was about if you have a silver backplate and a gold bezel, what solder would you use in that instance? And I think this can also talk about just if you're adding gold to your silver,
Yeah.
what would you go for?
You can use either, but I would personally use silver solder because the silver solder, first of all, is cheaper. It flows more easily. And if you do get silver solder on your bezel, you can clean it off. But those are the reasons that I would use it. And gold solder is wonderful, but it just doesn't run like silver solder does. So I would use silver solder.
Yeah, yeah. And like you said, I guess one of the main reasons it's cheaper, and
Yeah.
you can't tell the difference. You can't.
No.
You've got both metals there, so
Yeah.
it doesn't make any difference. But it's a good question. I think it's an
Yes.
important one to cover. The other one was about preparing solder, and I think like cutting it, and how do you go through that process? We do actually have some videos, so we can perhaps share some of those as well. But I mean, yeah, how do you prepare your solder?
Yeah, so I do cut my own pallions just because I'm so used to doing it. So when you buy your solder, it generally comes in long strips, and I cut. I'm just going to see if I've got any to hand here. I cut upwards on the strip, so that's my solder there. I cut upwards, and I use sheet cutters because it is sheet metal. So you use sheet cutters going upwards, and then it does curl. But if you use some flat pliers to flatten that down, and then you cut across in the same way. And then when you're cutting across, those will ping off. So keep your finger on it and cut it. So do that, and then cut across or cut down into an apron or my skin on my bench. It is a bit tricky, and solder is hard when you buy it. So you can actually hammer it to soften it down a bit. Yeah, but you get used to it. And those are really the only things that you can cut solder with, unless you get solder cutters. But that's another tool to buy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, we cover that in the intro part of the course, but also we do have a video on YouTube just kind of showing exactly what Hayley's just said. But yeah, I think one of the main tips that I found really helpful was the hammering it down, because when I first started using solder, it was just so tough, and everyone else just seemed to cut it so easily, and I was like, am I just super weak? But actually, a lot of the time it's been milled down, which means it's gone through a rolling mill, so it's thinner. But
Yeah.
not all of us have a rolling mill at home, so giving it a nice hammer on a steel block just to kind of make it a thinner piece to work with can really help.
The other thing is that your hands will actually get stronger over time. Often people start out and they struggle with the tools, but give it a few months and you'll have rock climber hands. So it works. It works your hands out.
Yeah, yeah. You build up that muscle memory, don't you? If you're doing the same thing consistently, then yeah, it gets better and better. Okay, let's pick a final question. So many to choose from. Oh, okay, here's one from Deborah. Does solder paste give the same strength as solid silver of the same grade? And perhaps you could just talk about paste and, whether you use it, what you might use it for. Yeah.
I hate paste. And
There
that's
we go. Heard it here first.
it just doesn't flow like normal solder. So it's got flux in it, and so that's really convenient. But it's extensive in that syringe. It dries out quickly. You can never really quite get exactly what you need, and it doesn't flow. So by all means use it if you're doing things like little earring posts onto stud earrings, fine. Or little jump rings. It's good for jump rings. That's probably the thing that I would only use it for. But for more detailed soldering, I would cut up solder. That's my opinion on that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that there's rare occasions where paste can be helpful, but on the whole, the general response that I've heard from all jewelers is like just no. I think like some granulation artists use paste because it's, a specialist technique and it's a way of working with. But for the general working with solder and silver work, it doesn't tend to be as popular. But everyone has different practices and
Yeah,
different processes, so you
absolutely.
never know. You never know.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think we got through most of the questions. I know there's a few left, so we will just go through and answer them by text afterwards. So feel free to come back and have a look at the replay. Hayley, thank you so, so much for coming and sharing some of your wisdom and knowledge with us today. It's been lovely having you guys. And thank you all for being here. So this is what we do in the diploma. We talk about jewelry all the time in all of the diploma programs, and that's what we want to do with you guys. And I know a lot of you are already involved, but if you're thinking about it and you got a lot out of today's session, you feel like actually it would be good to chat with jewelers regularly and talk about my practice and figure out how I can improve things, then we are absolutely here for you. And even if you're not joining this year and you're thinking of joining in the future, because we know it's a big kind of commitment, we're here and we just love helping you learn and being part of your journey. So thank you so much. So yes, thank you, Hayley. Lovely having you.
Thank
And
you.
yes, and we'll see you guys on another session very soon. Take care. Bye for now.
Bye.